In the year of great change, within the confines of a narrow canton, stood the sole gateway through which the trembling Qing Empire, that vast middle kingdom, still maintained faint contact with the outer world of barbarian lands. Here the air was thick, humid and heavy, saturated with the lingering scents of silk, fragrant tea, exotic spices, and the decaying waters running along the river. Yet, beneath this familiar bouquet, a new, ghostly aroma had long since begun to seep into the atmosphere, a scent that was both sweet and sickening, a subtle, choking smoke rising from countless hidden chimneys, tangled within the labyrinth of narrow, winding streets. This was the smell of opium, a scent reminiscent of slow, gentle death, gradually consuming the nation from within. On this tiny patch of land, along the pearl-blue riverbank, in the neighbourhood of the 13 trading factories, time itself seemed to stand suspended in a fragile, tense equilibrium. Behind high walls, European and American merchants resided, a small group of foreigners confined within a gilded cage. They were forbidden from entering the city proper, from learning the Chinese language, or bringing their wives and families into the country. They were both despised and tolerated, for they were the pale-haired barbarians, allowed by the Son of Heaven himself to purchase Chinese goods, yet held in contempt beneath their outward civility. But behind their outward modesty, a cold fire burned in their eyes, an insatiable greed and impatience, fueled by the knowledge that it was they, these traders, gentlemen from London and Boston, who had introduced this sweet poison into China, not out of malice, but purely for profit, for a lucrative, untainted gain. Little did they realize that the delicate balance maintained within this fragile enclave was on the verge of collapse, that the sweet, pungent smoke, so carefully nurtured, would soon be replaced by the acrid, destructive fumes of gunpowder. Here, in this very place, the threads of destiny binding two mighty, yet profoundly different empires, the colossal Middle Kingdom and the expanding Western powers, would intricately intertwine into a bloody knot, a tangled web of war and commerce, later remembered as the Opium Wars. This was no mere conflict. It was a story of something far graver. It was about how the most powerful Western empire, proud of its civilization, its moral standards, and its Christian faith, initiated a brutal war precisely to protect its right to addict an entire nation to narcotics. All of this, astonishingly, was fought over nothing more than tea. Before delving into the intoxicating swirl of opium smoke, it is essential to understand the root cause of this catastrophe. It was an economic imbalance lurking like a geological fault beneath the surface of global trade, quietly developing over decades until the inevitable seismic upheaval arrived. The name of this fissure was tea. By the end of the 15th century, Great Britain, the mistress of the seas and the world's foremost industrial power, found itself gripped by a feverish obsession with the beverage. What had begun as an exotic delicacy favoured by aristocrats transformed into a national obsession, spreading to every layer of society. From the opulent salons of London's high society, where ladies dressed in fine crinoline gowns sipped tea from delicate porcelain cups, to the smoky kitchens of factory workers in Chester, for whom a steaming mug of sweet tea offered a rare moment of joy after a grueling day in the factory. The entire nation had become addicted to this invigorating infusion. Tea became as much a part of British identity as redcoats, or the foggy skyline of the old world. It powered the engines of the Industrial Revolution, enabling workers to toil longer and harder. It fueled the burgeoning factories, the new machinery, and the rapid expansion of industry, shaping a society increasingly dependent on this potent, fragrant brew. In this way, tea became not only a cultural staple, but also an economic lever, one that would, in time, profoundly influence global dynamics. It was the catalyst that spurred Britain's insatiable appetite for Chinese tea, setting into motion a series of events that would ultimately rip apart the fabric of the Qing Empire and ignite a confrontation driven by commerce, addiction, and imperial ambition. He was the backbone of a burgeoning movement towards a sober lifestyle, one that was passionately promoted by Methodist preachers. His influence extended far beyond individual habits, fueling an entire industry that spanned everything from the production of fine porcelain tableware to the construction of majestic ships. Yet, despite this widespread admiration and the thriving commercial ecosystem it inspired, there existed a profound and unresolvable complication at the very heart of the matter. During that period, tea, a beverage that had become an essential part of daily life, was only cultivated in a single region across the entire world, China. The Qing Empire, the vast and powerful dynasty ruling over China, was fully aware of its exclusive control over this prized commodity. The Middle Kingdom, as it was often called, governed by the Manchu-led Qing dynasty, was a self-sufficient universe in itself, capable of producing everything its people needed. From rice and silk to porcelain and paper, China manufactured an abundance of goods, which allowed it to sustain a high degree of autonomy and prosperity. The Chinese worldview was characterized by a lofty sense of superiority, considering the rest of the world as subordinate territories populated by uncivilized barbarians. As a result, China felt little need for any foreign products from Europe or elsewhere. It was largely self-sufficient and content with its own riches. Meanwhile, British merchants struggled to introduce their wares to this anti-foreign empire, endeavouring to present their best textiles, timepieces, culinary curiosities, and decorative items. They offered renowned English wool fabrics, intricate knives, elegant clocks, and charming music boxes. The Chinese, however, greeted these presents with politeness, but bought only insignificant quantities of such exotic goods. The disparity was staggering. An enormous trade imbalance was born from this situation. Britain purchased massive amounts of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but in return, China bought almost nothing from Britain. So, how did the Europeans settle their accounts? The answer lay in one indispensable commodity: silver. It was the universal currency, a true measure of wealth and value. British merchants paid for their Chinese imports predominantly with silver coins and silver bars, which were sourced from the rich silver mines of the New World. Each year, countless ships belonging to the formidable East India Company, which held a monopoly over trade with China, set sail from Britain loaded with silver and returned crowded with barrels of tea. These ships arrived at Canton, then the only port open to foreign traders, and left heavily laden with precious cargoes. For Britain, whose economic principles relied heavily on mercantilism, where national wealth was believed to be measured solely in gold and silver, this trade imbalance was nothing short of catastrophic. The country was rapidly losing its silver reserves, risking a drain that could undermine its economic stability. The endless flow of silver from Britain to China appeared as a relentless tide, threatening to drain the national treasury dry. At the same time, China responded with calculated and meticulous efforts to tighten its grip on foreign trade, making life increasingly difficult for the foreigners trying to penetrate its markets. All trade activity was governed by the so-called Canton system, established in the mid-15th century, a framework designed less for profit maximization and more for control and isolation. Under this system, foreign merchants could only operate within a limited area, the city of Canton, now known as Guangzhou, and only during designated seasons of the year. They were forbidden from establishing direct contact with Chinese manufacturers, unable to negotiate and conduct transactions personally. Instead, all trade dealings had to go through a guild of 13 Chinese merchants, known as Kohong, that held an exclusive monopoly over foreign commerce. These merchants bore the heavy responsibility of maintaining discipline among foreign traders and ensuring their compliance. In return, they paid substantial bribes to imperial officials, securing their privileged position and keeping outsiders at bay. Additionally, foreigners faced strict restrictions on their movement within China. The traders resided solely in their trading factories situated along the riverbanks, and they were prohibited from entering the city, exploring the interior, or departing from these designated areas. Such measures served to further isolate China from the outside world, while consolidating its control over the lucrative trade. During that era, the Chinese authorities were strict about maintaining their cultural boundaries and social norms. Consequently, they refused to allow foreigners to learn their language, just as foreigners were discouraged from trying to acquire it. As a result, all communication between outsiders and the Chinese was conducted in broken pidgin English, an imperfect and simplified form of speech that served as a bridge, but never fully captured the richness of Chinese or English. Furthermore, foreigners operating within China were subject to its laws, which they often did not understand, and which they regarded as primitive or barbaric, thereby deepening the cultural divide. The principle of collective responsibility was another cornerstone of the Chinese legal system. Under this rule, if one individual committed an offence, the entire group associated with that person could be held accountable and suffer collective punishment. This approach reinforced social cohesion, but also meant that individual actions could have wide-reaching consequences for many. Adding to the complex social interactions was a notably humiliating etiquette, requiring foreigners to address Chinese authorities in a manner that was formal and deferential, an act akin to pleading or begging. One critical ritual that foreigners had to perform was the koutu, a ceremonial gesture involving 3 profound bows to the emperor's representative or his portrait. To Europeans, this gesture appeared as a clear acknowledgement of vassalage, a submissive act that symbolized acceptance of Chinese supremacy. A famous episode illustrating these cultural tensions occurred in 1793, when Lord Macartney embarked on a diplomatic mission aimed at expanding trade relations and establishing a British embassy in China. His failure to perform the koutu ritual properly led to rejection, leaving a lasting impression in history as a symbol of China's proud, assertive stance. The emperor's response was both blunt and legendary. He declared that, by virtue of heavenly favour, he, as the emperor, required no foreign goods because his realm possessed everything it needed. He dismissed the idea that foreign, especially European, products held any value and showed little interest in their outdated or bizarre artifacts. This stance, perceived by the British as arrogant and dismissive, was rooted in China's desire to defend its civilization from what it saw as corrupting influences of the West. In this clash, 2 great civilizations faced each other, each proud, each unwavering in its beliefs and values, and remained unable or unwilling to understand one another. The British traders, frustrated by the persistent imbalance in their trade, eventually fixated on a certain product that paradoxically was within their grasp, controlled by them, and possessed an astonishing, almost demonic power. This commodity had the potential not only to halt Britain's silver drain, but to reverse it entirely. As the British merchants racked their brains over how to solve the trade deficit, in the lush, fertile valleys of Bengal, vast fields stretched endlessly across the landscape, bursting with vibrant, fragrant blossoms. These millions of delicate flowers, with their white, pink, and purple petals, swayed gently in the breeze, filling the air with a hypnotic, intoxicating aroma. This crop was the opium poppy, producing a potent substance known as opium, an alkaloid derived from the milky, latex-like sap of immature poppy pods, long recognized for its powerful effects. Historically, this plant had been a source of relief from pain, used in traditional medicine across many cultures, including China. Its medicinal applications ranged from alleviating dysentery to soothing coughs, and it was occasionally employed as an aphrodisiac at courtly gatherings. Yet, despite its perceived benefits, opium remained an expensive medicine, accessible only to a privileged few, and its consumption was relatively limited at the time. Everything changed in the 15th century when Dutch traders who had established commercial relations with Taiwan began blending opium with tobacco and introducing the practice of smoking into China. This innovation transformed opium from a medicinal remedy into a highly addictive commodity that could be readily distributed and consumed on a massive scale. In this way, the seeds of a profound social and economic crisis were sown as opium's allure grew, spreading rapidly through Chinese society and setting the stage for unprecedented conflicts and contradictions. The new method of administration provided a far more rapid and intense sense of euphoria, creating an almost instant surge of pleasure that quickly overwhelmed the user. This powerful and immediate effect made the substance even more addictive, and its use began to spread beyond the initial circles of aristocrats and noble households. From the opulent palaces and luxurious salons of high society, this habit gradually seeped into the broader layers of the population, gaining momentum as more people sought the intense sensations it could produce. As early as the year 1729, the Emperor Yunjian, deeply troubled by the rapid proliferation of this dangerous addiction, issued his first edict aimed at curbing its spread. The decree strictly prescribed the sale and smoking of opium. Yet, despite this royal decree, enforcement proved virtually impossible, as the demand for the drug persisted and underground trade networks flourished. It was precisely on this nascent, yet increasingly illicit, market that the British, more specifically the all-powerful British East India Company, set their sights. Following the decisive victory at Plassey in 1757, the British East India Company effectively became the dominant ruler of Bengal, the wealthiest region of India. And it was here, in the fertile lands of Bengal, that the most suitable conditions existed for cultivating opium poppies. Recognizing the immense commercial potential, the company swiftly moved to establish a complete monopoly over the cultivation, production, and distribution of Bengal's opium. They imposed strict controls, forcing Indian peasants, often through coercion and the threat or use of violence, to abandon traditional food crops like rice in favor of opium poppy cultivation. Those who resisted were frequently expelled from their lands or subjected to harsh measures to ensure compliance. All the harvested raw opium was purchased by the company at fixed, deliberately low prices, effectively dictating the market's terms. The raw material was then transported to factories in cities like Patna and Benares, where it was processed into dense, approximately 1.5 kilogram spherical balls, compact, potent units of narcotic. These were packed carefully into wooden crates and chests, each crate bearing a distinctive seal of the British East India Company, a mark of assurance that the product met the highest quality standards. In this way, the entire operation was designed to give the appearance of legitimacy and quality control, maintaining the illusion of a regulated trade. The most intricate part of this elaborate scheme was yet to come. Since the British East India Company functioned as a quasi-governmental entity, It was engaged in official trade activities, such as the export of tea from Canton. Yet, openly trading in illegal substances like opium would have been a blatant violation of Chinese laws and could have led to a complete breakdown of diplomatic relations. To navigate this challenge, an ingenious system of money laundering and smuggling was devised. Annually, in Calcutta, the company organised large auctions where crates of opium were sold for silver to private traders, British, American, and Parsi merchants, collectively known as country traders. With this transference of ownership, the opium formally ceased to be the property of the East India Company, allowing the company to maintain a veneer of legal compliance while effectively escaping legal scrutiny. From this point onward, independent traders, often called opium smugglers, played a crucial role. They operated fast, specially built ships known as opium clippers, onboard vessels such as the Faiz Red Rover or the Sylph, which transported the deadly cargo toward China. These ships avoided direct entry into Canton, instead anchoring at a discreet point on Linton Island, located in the estuary of the Pearl River, a strategic location beyond the reach of Chinese authorities. Here, the older ships, converted into floating warehouses, served as storage points, or hulks, harbouring the opium in safety while waiting for a covert shipment. The Chinese smugglers, operating swiftly and nimbly using small agile boats called fast crabs or darting dragons, would approach these floating warehouses to make their exchanges. They paid the smugglers in silver, which served as the universal currency in this clandestine economy. From this hub, the opium was meticulously distributed across China through a vast clandestine network maintained by secret societies, corrupt officials, and underground brokers. The entire operation was shrouded in secrecy, ensuring that the illegal flow of narcotics went largely unnoticed by the authorities, at least for a time. Meanwhile, the silver earned through these transactions was gathered by the country traders at their offices in Canton, where they used it to purchase vouchers and bills of exchange issued by the East India Company, completing the shrouded financial cycle of the opium trade. The company's debt of bills eventually became the currency used to settle payments for tea. The circular process reached its final stage, but not in the way one might initially imagine. Instead of silver flowing from Britain to China, the flow reversed entirely. It was no longer Britain paying China for tea with silver. Now, China was paying Britain in silver, but for a different commodity altogether, the highly addictive drug. This silver, in turn, was used by the British to purchase tea, completing an intricate and insidious cycle. Such a scheme was a perfect example of how criminal enterprise can be woven tightly into international trade, involving countless individuals, from humble Indian farmers and labourers to wealthy London bankers. The scale of this illicit business grew exponentially, expanding like a rapidly accelerating wave. At the end of the 15th century, the annual importation of opium into China was estimated at roughly 4,000 chests. Fast forward to the year 1838, and this figure had skyrocketed to an astonishing 40,000 chests per year. Millions of Chinese people, from high-ranking mandarins, soldiers, and officials to ordinary artisans and peasants, had become regular users of the drug. Opium dens, filled with the fragrant smoke and semi-darkness, became as commonplace as tea houses, transforming entire districts into hubs of addiction. The epidemic of drug dependence morphed into a true national calamity. It hollowed out the physical and mental health of countless individuals, stripping away their free will and strength. Families were shattered, with many selling everything, including their children, in a desperate attempt to afford their next fix. The effects extended beyond individual health and familial stability, undermining the military's readiness by rendering soldiers unfit for service. Moreover, the economic fabric of the nation suffered profoundly as vast sums of silver flowed irretrievably out of the country, creating a gnawing hole in China's treasury. At this point, China itself was suffering from the drain of silver, leading to widespread deflation, increased taxation, and growing unrest among the populace. The Manchu Emperor Dao Guang, along with his advisors in the Forbidden City, watched helplessly as their mighty empire appeared to decay from within. They understood painfully well that unless this dangerous tide of poison was halted, the very survival of the state was at grave risk. Recognizing the urgency, the emperor made a decisive choice. A mission of utmost importance was to be undertaken. He resolved to send a man to Canton, known for his remarkable integrity, unwavering resolve, and vehement hatred for the opium trade, someone destined to challenge the imperial power of the British Empire itself. While British merchants in Canton counted their profits, and millions of Chinese sank deeper into the opium haze in Beijing within the Forbidden City's walls, intense debates raged behind palace gates. Emperor Dao Guang, who had ascended the throne in 1820, was a conscientious ruler, yet one plagued by indecision. He was deeply troubled by two dire consequences of the opium trade: the moral decline ravaging the Chinese population and the catastrophic outflow of silver from the imperial treasury. Within the court, two factions emerged: the liberals, proposing the legalization and regulation of opium, levying taxes on its trade, establishing official production, and thus attempting to stem the hemorrhage of silver; and the conservatives, insisting that the trade must be utterly and permanently abolished, with harsh penalties reserved for smugglers and traffickers. After much wavering, Emperor Daoguang ultimately leaned toward the conservative view. He realized that this was not merely an economic issue, but a matter of national survival. To carry out this crucial task, he appointed a man whose name would become synonymous with patriotism and unwavering moral integrity throughout China. Lindsay, as he was known, embodied the ideal of a Confucian official, dedicated, honest, and fiercely committed to his country's welfare. Born in the year 1821 in the province of Fujian, he was raised in a humble family of a poor scholar. Through extraordinary intelligence and relentless dedication, Lindsay excelled in academic exams, swiftly climbing the bureaucratic ladder. His career included service as governor in several provinces, where he gained a reputation for efficiency, fairness, and incorruptibility, qualities that were rare gems within the heavily bribed and morally compromised Qing administration. He was renowned as a man of unwavering integrity, often described as having a blue sky purity of character. His reputation for honesty was so impeccable that he earned a reputation as a symbol of moral clarity. Deeply troubled by the widespread opium crisis, Lin Zexu, who served as governor of the provinces of Hubei and Hunan, dedicated himself to eradicating the devastating drug epidemic that was ravaging China. His determination led him to implement a vigorous anti-narcotics campaign, during which he confiscated thousands of opium pipes and a vast quantity of the narcotic itself, demonstrating his firm belief that evil could and should be eradicated through decisive action. His conviction was rooted in the conviction that force was justified in the battle against vice. By the end of the year 1838, Emperor Dao Guang appointed Lin Zexu as a special imperial commissioner with extraordinary powers to dismantle the opium trade within Guangdong province. This appointment was unprecedented in Chinese history, entrusting Lin with full authority to take any measure necessary. His arrival in Canton in March of the following year was met with fervent enthusiasm by the local populace, who viewed him as a saviour confronting a grave threat to their well-being. Lin's journey to Canton turned into a triumphant march, an event that the people regarded as a form of moral victory and a hopeful beginning to a crusade against the drug menace. Upon reaching Canton in March of 1839, Lin Zexu wasted no time, launching a campaign marked by relentless energy and strategic planning. His approach was methodical and multi-phased, designed to target both supply and demand. The first component focused on suppressing the domestic consumption of opium. Lin initiated a large-scale crackdown on Chinese consumers and illicit traders alike. Extensive arrests were carried out, and all individuals found in possession of opium or pipes were mandated to surrender their illicit goods within a 2-month period. Those who refused faced severe penalties, including public executions aimed at striking fear into the hearts of potential violators. Hundreds of Chinese smugglers and traffickers were apprehended, some of whom were subjected to public executions as a deterrent to others, thereby intensifying the message that the government was serious about ending this scourge. The second part of Lin's firm strategy involved moral persuasion. As a sincere Confucian scholar, he believed in the power of moral appeal and conviction. He issued numerous proclamations directed at foreign traders, urging them to consider the moral implications of their actions. In these messages, Lin appealed to their conscience, emphasizing that while they profited from the opium trade, they were also poisoning the very people they claimed to serve. He drew a stark analogy, questioning whether, if foreigners imported addictive substances into their own nations, they would not condemn such actions as malicious and unjust. One of his most famous efforts was a letter addressed to Queen Victoria, filled with righteous indignation and naive hope that the British monarch would recognise the moral wrongfulness of her country's role in the trade. In his letter, Lin asked how the Queen would feel if her subjects were being poisoned by foreign drugs, and implored her to ban the cultivation of opium poppies in India. Although this plea was heartfelt, it was ultimately never delivered to the Queen herself. However, to the British officials observing these events from afar, these moral arguments appeared as mere rhetoric, a naive attempt to moralize in the face of stark reality. They regarded China's moral appeals as hollow and ineffective, especially in light of their own economic interests. Confronted with persistent defiance and the failure of persuasion, Lin Zexu escalated his measures toward outright force. On the 18th of March, in 1839, he issued an order that sent shockwaves through the foreign trading community. He demanded that all foreign merchants immediately surrender any remaining opium stored on their ships or warehouses in the Linton Island area. To enforce this demand, Lin took an unprecedented step. He laid siege to a cluster of 13 foreign trading offices known as factories. Chinese troops encircled these establishments, cutting off supplies and isolating the traders. All Chinese domestic staff associated with the foreign trade were recalled, and the supply of food and water was halted, effectively trapping the foreign traders within these compound walls. Approximately 350 foreigners, including Captain Charles Elliot, the chief superintendent of British trade, found themselves caught in this tense and dangerous standoff, practically held hostage. Captain Charles Elliot, representing the British Crown, was caught in an especially desperate predicament. Despite his personal disdain for the opium trade, which he often condemned as a shameful stain on Britain's reputation, his professional duty was to protect British nationals and protect British commercial interests. Witnessing the seriousness of Lin Zexu's resolve, and fearing for the lives of his compatriots, Elliot recognised that further resistance was futile. Reluctantly, he ordered all British traders to surrender their opium stocks, thereby complying with Lin's demands and de-escalating the crisis, Он осуществил свой план с одной важной оговоркой, которая сделала его шаг по-настоящему хитрым и стратегическим. Вместо того, чтобы требовать сдачи наркотиков китайским властям, он потребовал, чтобы их сдали ему лично, как представителю британского правительства. Такая уступка означала, что частная собственность торговцев превращалась в собственность британской короны. В результате Элиот выписал торговцам специальные расписки, в которых обещал, что полуофициальное ведомство Великобритании возместит им полную стоимость конфискованного товара. Этот умный ход имел два важных последствия. Во-первых, любое злоупотребление с опиумом теперь рассматривалось бы не как полицейскую операцию по пресечению контрабанды, а как открытое ограбление со стороны британского государства, что могло стать поводом для войны. Во-вторых, такой подход давал возможность британским властям более гибко управлять ситуацией и, в случае необходимости, использовать конфискацию как инструмент давления или торга. Благодаря этой хитрости Линдзи Сюй достиг своей цели. За несколько недель британцы сдали 21 306 ящиков опиума, огромное количество, стоимость которого исчислялась миллионами бронированных фунтов стерлингов. Весь этот план был выполнен в точности, и Линь честно сдержал свое слово. Осада и блокада фактории прекратились, и иностранные торговцы получили разрешение покинуть город Гуанчжоу, тогдашний центр опиумной торговли. А уже 3 июня 1839 года на берегу городка Хумень перед многочисленными чиновниками, офицерами и местными жителями начался грандиозный акт уничтожения конфискованной порции отравы. Были выкопаны 3 огромные траншеи, которые затем заполнили водой и слоем извести, создавая своеобразное обеззараживание. Рабочие вскрывали ящики с опиумом, высыпая его в кипящую смесь, в которой он разлагался и распылялся, а затем смывало в море. Этот процесс продолжался 3 недели, 23 дня непрерывных усилий. В этот момент казалось, что зло побеждено, а национальная честь вознаграждена. Но в глубине души, несмотря на торжество, сжигание опиума поднимало в враждебных странах и внутри самой Британии новые вопросы. В Лондоне торговцы, размахивая обещанными расписками Элиота, уже требовали не только компенсацию за ущерб, но и мести, считая, что их права должны быть защищены силой. И их голоса начали слышаться. Новость о событиях в Кантоне достигла Лондона к осени 1839 года, и эта весть произвела политический взрыв, начав цепь событий, способных перевернуть весь баланс сил. Однако реакция британского общества и элит оказалась далеко не однородной. История о том, как Британия решила начать войну с Китаем, это гораздо больше, чем рассказ о жадности и стремлении к имперскому доминированию. Это были проявления мощи лоббистских групп, о манипуляции общественным мнением, о горячих дебатах, в которых сталкивались моральные ценности страны и ее материальные интересы. В их числе сыграли ключевую роль именно опиумные торговцы и крупные коммерческие круги, связанные с ними. В частности, за правительственной ситуацией стоял Джеймс Мэттисон, один из ведущих предпринимателей того времени и один из основателей крупнейшей торговой компании Jardine Madison & Co., которая сделала состояние на контрабанде опиума. Вернувшись в Лондон, Мэттисон активизировал свою деятельность, развернул ожесточенную кампанию. Он и его сторонники создали комитет, который массами отправлял в парламент и правительство петиции, оказав тем тактическую поддержку. Они умело изменили тон дискурса. Разговор перестал вращаться вокруг опиума и сосредоточился на вопросах чести и достоинства. Они говорили о необходимости защищать герб и национальную репутацию, обвиняя китайцев в жестоком обращении с британскими подданными. Так, например, они изображали Линдзи Сюй, как человека, устраивающего голод в факториях, чтобы заставить британцев сдаться или уступить. Эти активисты утверждали, что необходимо защищать свободу торговли и достоинство страны, и для этого даже наняли талантливых публицистов. Их задача состояла в создании убедительного образа Китая как деспотичной, жестокой империи, которая, несмотря на свою древность, оказалась неспособной адаптироваться к новому миру. В газетах и публикациях китайская цивилизация изображалась как варварская и косная, жестокая в обращении с иностранцами и неподкупная в своих порядках, что требовало силового вмешательства и открытой мягкой силы западных цивилизаций. Эти инициативы являлись одними из первых в истории масштабных информационных кампаний, призванных формировать общественное мнение и давление на политиков. The government of William Faure, led by Prime Minister Lord Melbourne and Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, found itself under immense pressure from multiple directions. Palmerston, a fervent advocate of what could be called the gunboat diplomacy approach, believed that Britain's interests across the globe should be safeguarded primarily through the threat, if necessary, of military force. He was convinced that negotiations with semi-civilized nations, such as China, could only be effective from a position of strength and assertiveness. To him, the conflict initiated by Lin Zexu's actions was not merely a crackdown on drug trafficking, but a direct challenge to British imperial power, which demanded a firm and decisive response. At the same time, the British government faced significant financial strains. Customs duties on tea alone accounted for about 10% of the entire British budget, making trade disruptions potentially catastrophic to national finances. Any interruption in the tea trade risked triggering a financial crisis, not to mention the heavy burden that would fall on the Treasury if the government were to compensate merchants for the confiscation of opium, as Eliot had promised. It seemed far simpler and politically safer to impose demands on China and insist that it pay for the damages. However, opposition to war in Britain was not negligible. Strong voices came from religious dissenters, such as Quakers and Methodists, who viewed the opium trade as fundamentally immoral and antithetical to Christian principles. These groups organized rallies, wrote pamphlets, and publicly condemned the government for its perceived complicity in supporting drug traffickers. Nevertheless, among the voices of conscience, one prominent figure stood out, a young yet already influential Member of Parliament from the Conservative Party, William Ewart Gladstone. By April of 1840, the nation was engaged in heated debates in the House of Commons regarding the prospect of war with China. During these proceedings, Gladstone delivered one of the most passionate and memorable speeches of his career. In it, he declared that he could not recall a war more unjust in origin, a conflict more likely to tarnish Britain's reputation forever. He condemned the government's actions, asserting that the British flag was flying over countries not to promote justice or fair trade, but to shield and justify the notorious opium trade. Gladstone didn't shy away from directly accusing the government of stirring up war to protect their economic interests linked to drugs. His speech sharply criticised the moral foundations of the government's policy and questioned the justice of unleashing military might to defend the income derived from the illicit opium trade. The debate grew fierce, with arguments on both sides highlighting the deep divisions within British society. Despite the strength of the opposition and public outcry, the majority ultimately voted in favour of war. The resolution to dispatch a naval expedition to China was approved with a razor-thin margin, passing by only 9 votes, 271 in favour versus 262 against. This narrow victory underscored how contentious and balanced the decision was, not a unifying call to arms, but a hesitant and divided choice prompted by complex economic and political considerations. Britain was about to enter into conflict over a matter that, in many eyes, was morally questionable and politically fraught, leaving a heavy burden of guilt and ambivalence. In late 1839, an order was issued to assemble the British Expeditionary Force. It comprised 16 warships, 4 armed paddle steamers, 2 troop transports, and approximately 4,000 soldiers, predominantly Sikh troops recruited from British India, alongside a handful of British regiments. The command was entrusted to Admiral George Elliot, a cousin of Charles Elliot, and Major General Hugh Gough. Their instructions were unambiguous: punish the Chinese for their insults, secure a compensation for both the opium seized and the damages inflicted, force open new trading ports, and, as a strategic goal, acquire a harbour island along China's coast to serve as a military and commercial base. The British imperial lion roared loudly, gearing itself for the upcoming confrontation. His fleet, bearing not only cannons, but also the full might of the Industrial Revolution, had already crossed the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. This formidable armada was not merely on a mission of warfare. It carried with it the intention to deliver a lesson to a proud ancient empire that had fallen far behind the times, a lesson that would remain etched in history forever. When the first vessels of the British squadron appeared off the shores of China in June of 1840, few within the Qing dynasty could have anticipated the magnitude of the disaster that lay ahead. China had not engaged in a conflict with a European power for over 1.5 centuries. Its rulers and military leaders lived under the illusion of their own superiority, relying on the massive size of their army and their past victories over nomadic tribes. They were entirely unprepared for a confrontation with a modern military machine of the 21st century. The First Opium War became a classic example of an asymmetric conflict between two vastly different technological and tactical eras. The British forces, though modest in number, possessed an overwhelming technological edge. Central to their strength was the Navy, an assembly of ships equipped not only with traditional line of battleships and frigates armed with dozens of heavy cannon capable of exact and devastating fire, but also with secret innovations, steam-powered paddle-wheel frigates. Among these, the most famous was the ironclad Nemesis, financed privately by companies such as Jardine, Matheson and Co. These steam vessels, independent of the wind and currents, could navigate shallow waters and rivers inaccessible to sailing ships, making them incredibly maneuverable. They could even tow larger vessels through congested or shallow areas, confounding traditional expectations of naval combat. To the Chinese, whose fleet consisted of wooden junks armed with smoothbore cannons, these steaming, puffing iron monsters, advancing against the wind, seemed like creatures conjured from the depths of hell. Meanwhile, British infantry was equipped with the latest percussion-cap muskets, which were far more reliable in damp weather than the older flintlocks. Their soldiers were highly trained professionals, capable of coordinated actions under fire, having undergone rigorous drill exercises. Supporting them was a modern field artillery capable of delivering powerful strikes, including lightweight, mobile rocket launchers like the Kangrewa, which produced terrifying psychological effects on their foes. In stark contrast, the Qing forces, despite their immense numbers, potentially up to 1 million soldiers, were critically outdated. The empire's army was divided into two main groups: the elite Manchu banner armies, comprising soldiers armed primarily with traditional weapons like bows and close combat instruments, and the larger, less organised Green Standard troops, who relied heavily on outdated weapons. The Manchu warriors, brave as they were, fought according to centuries-old tactics, still placing bets on mounted archery and hand-to-hand combat derived from the conquests of the 15th century. Their firearms, such as matchlock, arquebuses, or jingoles, were imprecise, slow to reload, and practically useless in rainy weather, rendering their technology rapidly obsolete. The Chinese Navy was composed of hundreds of small, sluggish wooden junks, lightly armed with a handful of small cannons, many firmly affixed to the deck without the capacity to adjust their angles. They depended heavily on static coastal fortifications built of stone and earth, meant to protect their shores from invasion. However, these fortifications were antiquated. Their artillery was primitive and incapable of withstanding the concentrated and disciplined firepower of the British naval and land forces. As the conflict unfolded, the overwhelming disparity in technology, tactics, and preparation made the outcome inevitable, marking a turning point in the history of military confrontation between the age-old empire and the advanced industrial navies of the West. The conflict surrounding the Opium Wars was not characterized by a continuous stream of battles stretching endlessly over time. Instead, it unfolded as a series of punitive expeditions, during which the British systematically targeted and seized key coastal cities and fortified ports, aiming to pressure Beijing into diplomatic negotiations. The initial phase, spanning the years of 1840 and 1841, saw a decisive strike against the city of Chusan, marking the beginning of a complex diplomatic struggle. The British deliberately avoided the heavily guarded city of Canton, where they had anticipated resistance, and instead led their assault further north, capturing the island of Chushan and imposing a blockade on the mouths of the Yangtze River. This aggressive move sent shockwaves through the Qing court, igniting widespread panic among the imperial leadership. In a bid to appease the invaders, Emperor Daoguang, suspecting treachery, blamed the high-ranking official Linzi Shui for the miscalculation and ordered his exile. Meanwhile, a new governor of Manchuria, Qi Shan, entered into diplomatic negotiations with Charles Elliot, a British envoy. By January of 1841, they signed an initial preliminary agreement, known as the Chuanpi Treaty, in which China ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain and agreed to pay a hefty indemnity. However, this treaty failed to satisfy either party. The British government found it too lenient and withdrew Elliot from the negotiations, replacing him with a more formidable representative, Sir Henry Pottinger. The Emperor, furious over what he perceived as an unauthorized concession of territory, ordered preparations for war to retaliate against the affront. The second phase of the conflict, occurring in 1841, saw fierce fighting in Canton and the capture of strategic forts. Military operations resumed with renewed vigour as the British launched assaults on the forts guarding the approaches to Canton. These fortifications, known as the Foothills of God, stood at the mouth of the Pearl River, serving as vital defensive points. Here, the technological superiority of the British forces became vividly apparent. Ironclad steamers like the Nemesis navigated deep into Chinese waters, unhindered by the strong currents, crushing the defenders' firepower with their advanced weaponry. British troops conducted daring landings, storming and capturing the forts in brutal bayonet charges. Despite the determined resistance of Chinese soldiers and officers, including Admiral Guan Tianpei, they were ultimately besieged and overwhelmed. The city of Canton itself was soon encircled, and to avoid total destruction, the local authorities paid a colossal ransom to buy off the invading forces. By the third phase, in the year 1842, the British naval forces launched a campaign along the Yangtze River, leading to the fall of Nanking. Recognizing that mere attacks on the southern coast would not break Beijing's resistance, Sir Henry Pottinger decided to strike directly at the heart of the Chinese Empire. The British fleet advanced into the mighty Yangtze River, China's main internal artery, made navigable only by the use of specially designed steam-powered vessels capable of battling the powerful downstream currents. Along the riverbanks, British forces methodically captured numerous Chinese towns, tightening their grip on the region. The campaign reached its most decisive point at the assault on the city of Jiaxian, situated where the Yangtze meets the Grand Canal, a crucial waterway through which grain from the southern provinces was transported to the imperial capital. The battle for Jiaxian became the bloodiest of the entire war. The Manchu garrison, foreseeing the inevitable, fought to the bitter end, some even resorting to killing their wives and children to prevent them falling into British hands, before turning their bayonets against the invaders. The city was eventually captured, but the victory was marred by widespread acts of mass suicide and extreme brutality. Securing Jiaxian cut off the supply lines to Nanking, the southern imperial capital, opening a direct pathway for the British to threaten the city. When the British fleet finally reached the walls of Nanking, Emperor Dao Guang realized that further resistance was futile. Faced with the impending fall of the city, he sought peace. The war was officially concluded on the Yangtze River on the 29th of August, amidst the waters near the ancient city of Nanking, where on the harbour stood the British 64-gun line of battleship, HMS Cornwallis, serving as a stark symbol of Britain's victorious might. On his flagship's bridge, within the Admiral's cabin, two delegations had gathered, each representing vastly different worlds. On one side stood Sir Henry Pottinger, along with the highest-ranking British officers, their expressions marked by confidence and unwavering resolve, embodying the victorious power that believed it had secured a decisive triumph. Opposite them, high-ranking Qing officials, including representatives from the imperial courts Sir Shentu and Li Bu, dressed in their official robes, bore faces etched with bitterness, shame, and a complete lack of understanding about what was happening. It was beneath the barrel of British cannons that a document was signed, a document which would later be remembered in Chinese historiography as the beginning of a century of national humiliation, the Treaty of Nanking. The Nanking Treaty was far more than a simple peace agreement. It was, in essence, an act of unconditional surrender dictated by the victorious British. It marked the complete rupture of the traditional Chinese relations with the outside world, a system that had endured for centuries. To better understand its profound impact, let us explore its main provisions, which reveal the depth of the wound inflicted upon the Chinese nation. Foremost among the treaty's demands was the staggering indemnity that China was forced to pay to Britain, 21 million silver dollars, an enormous sum at the time, equivalent to roughly 6 million British pounds. This colossal amount was divided into three parts: $6 million as compensation for the destruction of opium, $3 million to settle debts owed by Chinese merchants in the Hong Kong district to British creditors, and the remaining $12 million to cover Britain's military expenses. In essence, China was made to pay for a war it not only did not initiate, but was forced into fighting against itself. This indemnity placed an enormous strain on the Qing treasury, causing a sharp rise in taxes levied upon peasants and common people, thereby heightening their suffering. Additionally, the treaty compelled China to cede the island of Hong Kong in perpetuity to Britain. This rocky, sparsely populated island, situated at the mouth of the Pearl River, held immense strategic importance due to its location. It swiftly became a vital British military and commercial outpost, an open port and warehouse with an unguarded gate, as one British politician famously expressed, through which an even greater flood of opium and other goods would soon pour into China. Furthermore, the treaty dismantled the previous Canton system, which had tightly regulated foreign trade for centuries. Beyond Canton, 4 additional ports, Amoy, now Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were opened for trade and foreign residents. The British gained the right to lease land in these ports and to build houses, warehouses, and churches, establishing permanent footholds. Shanghai, which was then a modest town located at the mouth of the Yangtze River, rapidly evolved into China's largest international trading and financial hub. The monopoly held by the Kohong Guild, an exclusive trading association, was abolished, allowing British merchants to trade freely with any Chinese traders willing to engage. The treaty also mandated that British officials would communicate with their Chinese counterparts as equals, rather than as supplicants before masters. This was a direct challenge to the centuries-old Chinese worldview that placed China at the center of the universe, the Chinese concept of the Middle Kingdom. Most significantly, China was deprived of its sovereign right to impose tariffs on imported goods. Instead, tariffs were fixed at low rates, no higher than 5%, and could be changed only through mutual agreement. This regulation stripped China of a vital economic tool, undermining its ability to protect its internal markets from foreign competition. Yet, even these humiliating terms appeared insufficient to satisfy the British appetite for dominance. The following year, in 1843, an additional treaty, the so-called Bogue, or Supplementary Agreement, was signed, introducing further devastating conditions. The first of these was the principle of extraterritoriality, an element that would profoundly impact China's sovereignty. British subjects residing within China were effectively removed from the reach of Chinese jurisdiction. If a British national committed a crime against a Chinese citizen, he was to be tried by a British consul under British law. In reality, this arrangement often resulted in near total impunity for foreigners, fostering frequent tensions and growing resentment among the Chinese population. This situation was further reinforced by a crucial article about the most favoured nation status, which stipulated that any future privilege granted by China to another country would automatically extend to Britain as well. Such a provision acted as a clever diplomatic mechanism, enabling Western powers to act in concert, each securing concessions from China at the expense of the other. Soon, similar treaties were signed with the United States and France, and thanks to this article, any gains they obtained became effectively part of Britain's diplomatic and economic holdings. The consequences of the Treaty of Nanking proved disastrous for China and the entire Western world. For Britain, in particular, it unlocked a vast Chinese market, bringing about a decade of unprecedented prosperity. The opium trade, instead of diminishing, flourished exuberantly, even as it remained officially illegal. For China, however, this marked the beginning of a profound decline. The humiliating defeat in the war and the terms of the treaty dealt a heavy blow to the prestige of the Manchu Qing dynasty. The Chinese populace saw their government as powerless to defend the nation against foreign invaders. The economic crisis, triggered by the burden of reparations and the massive outflow of silver, plunged the country into widespread poverty. These hardships created fertile ground for the most destructive uprising in Chinese history, the Taiping Rebellion, which raged from 1850 to 1864, claiming the lives of over 20 million people and ultimately dismantling the foundations of the Qing Empire. The First Opium War did not resolve any of China's underlying problems. Instead, it merely opened Pandora's box, releasing demons that would torment China for the next century. Western appetites had only begun to be awakened, and the prospect of even more brutal conflicts loomed on the horizon. The Treaty of Nanking failed to bring true peace. It merely provided a temporary pause during which both sides accumulated grievances and prepared for future confrontation. For the Western powers, the concessions won in 1842 were merely the initial steps in a long series of demands. Trade in the newly opened ports advanced at a sluggish pace, much slower than the Western nations desired. Meanwhile, China's massive internal market remained largely inaccessible. Although opium trade persisted, it continued to operate on an illegal basis, posing ongoing risks. Britain, and soon France as well, under the leadership of Napoleon II, harboured even greater ambitions. Their goals were clear and challenging. First, to fully legalise opium, turning it into a standard taxable commodity. Second, to open up all of China for trade, including its interior regions and the Yangtze River. And third, to establish permanent diplomatic missions in Beijing, aiming to gain direct access to the emperor and his court, while bypassing the Canton officials who often resisted foreign influence. On the Chinese side, the Treaty of Nanking was perceived as a temporary humiliation, an imposition forcibly extracted from a weakened nation. Officials in Canton responded with active sabotage, deliberately delaying compliance with its terms and creating ever more obstacles for foreign traders. The deepening hatred for the foreign devils grew as they perceived foreigners as pillaging their land with opium and behaving arrogantly as if they were the true masters of China. Over time, this hostility and resentment only intensified, laying the groundwork for future conflicts and violent unrest. In the midst of the mid-19th century, tensions between China and Western powers reached a boiling point, ignited by a seemingly minor incident that would soon escalate into a full-scale conflict. All that was needed was a spark, an incident to rekindle animosities long smouldering beneath the surface. And this spark appeared swiftly in October of the year 1856. At that time, Chinese officials in the port city of Canton, Guangzhou, detained a ship named the Arrow. This vessel was of Chinese construction, yet it was registered under the Hong Kong flag and operated under the British ensign. The ship was commanded by a Briton, and its crew consisted of Chinese sailors. The Chinese authorities accused the crew of piracy and smuggling, and as a result, they arrested 12 sailors. The incident provoked a furious response from the British side. Harry Parkes, the British consul in Canton, a man known for his quick temper and aggressive demeanour, asserted that the arrest of the crew aboard a British-flagged vessel, along with the act of flying the British flag, was a gross insult to Britain. Although it remained unclear whether the flag had been raised at the exact moment of the arrest, Parkes demanded the immediate release of the sailors and issued a formal demand for apologies from the Chinese officials. The imperial governor of Canton, Yeminchen, a man notorious for his xenophobia, complied with the release, but refused to offer any apologies. For Parkes and the British colonial authorities in Hong Kong, this incident was a perfect pretext, an overly convenient justification to ignite a new war with China. They perceived it as an opportunity to extract concessions from the Qing Empire, concessions that had eluded them in previous negotiations. The British soon found an ally in France. Emperor Napoleon II was also eager to seize this opportunity to strengthen France's position in China and to safeguard the interests of French Catholic missionaries operating in the vast empire. The spark for renewed conflict was further fanned by the execution of one Auguste Chapdelaine, a French missionary who had entered the Guangdong province illegally. This series of events, two seemingly minor but strategically advantageous incidents, prompted the two leading European nations, Britain and France, to form a coalition. Their shared animosity towards China and the desire for territorial and commercial gains led to the outbreak of the Second Opium War. The conflict unfolded in two main stages, separated by a period of diplomatic negotiations. Between the years of 1856 and 1858, the Chinese city of Canton was captured, and the treaties of Tianjin were signed. In 1857, after bombarding the city, Anglo-French troops seized and occupied Canton entirely. The Chinese governor of Canton, Yeminchen, was taken prisoner and subsequently exiled to Calcutta, where he eventually died. Following the conquest of Canton, the Allied fleet advanced northward toward Beijing. They battled their way through the fortresses of Dagu, which guarded the confluence of the Hai River leading to Tianjin, and then to the imperial capital. The Qing court, gripped by panic, was compelled to negotiate. By June of the same year, the notorious Tianjin treaties were signed, agreements made separately with Britain, France, the United States, and Russia. These treaties proved even more humiliating than the earlier Nanjing Treaty. China was forced to open 10 additional ports to foreign trade, allowed foreigners to travel freely within its borders, guaranteed protections for Christian missionaries, and consented to establish diplomatic missions within Beijing itself. Most significant of all, although the issue of opium trafficking was not explicitly mentioned in the British Treaty, it was effectively legalized through the establishment of tariffs on the trade. Tariffs that were incorporated into the treaties of the United States and Russia. This legal framework laid the groundwork for an expansion of opium imports into Chinese markets, with all the moral and social consequences that entailed. The second phase of the conflict, spanning from 1859 to 1860, saw an aggressive push towards Beijing and the storming and looting of the imperial summer palace. It appeared as if the war was nearing its conclusion, with a swift victory for the Allied forces. However, when British and French diplomats arrived at the Dagu forts to proceed to Beijing for the formal ratification of the treaties, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The Chinese, having taken advantage of the temporary pause, had diligently restored and strengthened the fortifications under the leadership of a talented Mongol prince named Sengchun. This unexpected reinforcement of the defences demonstrated that despite the apparent exhaustion of hostilities, the Qing dynasty was still prepared to resist further invasion, revealing the complex and unpredictable nature of this conflict. They refused to allow the fleet to pass, suggesting instead that the diplomats follow alternative routes around the harbour. This act of defiance was seen as an insult by British Admiral James Hope, who, believing himself slighted, attempted to force his way through with military might. However, his efforts quickly ended in failure. The Chinese artillery opened a relentless barrage, unleashing a thunderous fire that sank several British gunboats and inflicted severe losses on the Allied forces. Despite the fierce assault, the defenders managed to repulse the attack. This defeat was nothing short of humiliating for the British and their allies, igniting a fiery rage in London and Paris. In response, the decision was made to dispatch a much larger and more formidable expeditionary force to China, led by Lord Elgin, son of the famous Lord Elgin, who had once transported the Parthenon marbles from Greece, and Baron Groll. By the year of 1860, this force, numbering 20,000 men, had arrived on Chinese soil. This time, they were well prepared. Their campaign culminated in a crushing victory over the army of Sengarinchi, followed by the complete capture of the Dagu forts, and then a direct march towards Beijing. The Chinese Emperor Xianfeng, along with his court, was thrown into a panic and hastily retreated from the capital. The way was now open to the Forbidden City. Yet, before entering the imperial residence, the Allied forces committed an act that would forever be remembered as one of the most shameful episodes in the history of Western colonialism. Just a few kilometers northwest of the city walls of Beijing, an extraordinary sight unfolded. a veritable wonder. It was not merely a palace, but an entire world within a world, a dream incarnated in stone, wood, silk, and water. This magnificent complex was called Yuan Min Yuan, the Garden of Perfect Calm, but the Europeans simply referred to it as the Summer Palace. Covering a vast territory several times the size of the Vatican City, with its hills, lakes, canals, and streams, the palace was dotted with more than 200 pavilions, halls, temples, libraries, and theatres. It represented a unique harmony of traditional Chinese architecture fused with European Baroque influences, designed for the Emperor Tanglin by Jesuit missionaries. Far from the formalities and confinements of the Forbidden City, this was where the Qing emperors lived, worked, and relaxed. Over the course of 1.5 centuries, it became the home to the world's greatest collection of artifacts and treasures, an unparalleled repository of China's cultural and artistic achievements. Within its grounds, priceless porcelain vases, jade and bronze works, thousands of scrolls of calligraphy and paintings were carefully preserved. There was a vast library housing rare manuscripts, as well as imperial garments, jewellery, astronomical instruments, and more. The Yuan Min Yuan was not merely the imperial residence, it was a sanctuary of Chinese civilization, embodying artistic brilliance and cultural richness. In October of 1860, after treacherously capturing, torturing, and killing members of the Anglo-French delegation that had arrived for negotiations, Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, made a startling decision. Driven by what he considered necessary retribution, he resolved to strike directly at the Emperor himself, aiming to deliver a blow that would be felt profoundly. However, he wished to avoid destroying the Forbidden City, concerned that razing it might lead to the complete collapse of the Qing dynasty and usher in chaos that could hamper trade and international relations. His target was the Yuan Min Yuan, considered the heart of Chinese imperial power. Officially, his motivation was revenge for the murdered envoys, but in reality, his true objective was to humiliate the emperor and the dynasty, demonstrating that there was no place, no sanctuary, that could shield them from Western wrath. Initially, the palace was subjected to a brutal looting. For 2 days, British and French soldiers and officers rampaged through the complex, transforming into a frenzied mob of plunderers. They stormed the pavilions, smashing everything in their path, stripping the site of its treasures, and leaving destruction in their wake. They shattered priceless vases to extract precious stones. They cut away the silk paintings from ornate frames. They stuffed their pockets with pearls and gold. Officers organised auctions, trading the looted treasures among themselves. One British officer, Captain Charles Gordon, the same man who would later become the hero of Khartoum, recorded that they pillaged, ransacked, and burned everything in sight. It was the act of vandals, driven by rage so intense that feelings of compassion or remorse found no place in their hearts. Soldiers donned the imperial robes, seized wines from imperial cellars, and broke furniture crafted from rare woods. Over the course of just 2 days, a treasure accumulated over centuries was completely emptied. Whatever couldn't be carried away was deliberately destroyed. Yet, Lord Elgin found the destruction insufficient. On October 18th, in the year 1860, he issued an order to burn the Yuan Min Yuan to the ground. 3,500 British soldiers were dispatched to carry out this command. Methodically, pavilion by pavilion, they set fire to everything that remained capable of burning. A towering column of black smoke, apparently rising from Beijing, ascended into the sky. The conflagration raged for 3 days until nothing but smouldering ruins and burnt marble remnants of European palaces remained. This act of vandalism lacked any military justification. It was pure barbarism. The destruction shocked Europe and drew widespread condemnation. The acclaimed French writer Victor Hugo addressed a letter to Captain Bugeaud, describing how two robbers entered Yuanming Yuan, one loot, the other torch. Before history, one of these thieves would be known as France, the other as England. Hugo expressed hope that the day would come when a liberated and purified France would restore this stolen treasure to the plundered nation of China. For the Chinese people, the burning of Yuanming Yuan became an indelible wound, a symbol of the utmost shame and barbarity perpetrated by what they considered civilized Europeans. To this day, this event remains one of the most painful episodes in China's collective memory, a constant reminder of the century of humiliation they endured. After this act of intimidation, the Qing government was shattered entirely. The emperor's brother, Prince Gung, signed the Beijing Convention, which reaffirmed all the conditions of the Tianjin treaties and added new demands. The enormous indemnity was increased. Southern Jeju and Jilun, opposite Hong Kong, were ceded to Britain, and permanent embassies opened in Beijing. The war was over, and Western powers had secured all their demands. The gates of China were literally torn from their hinges, flung wide open. Opium, the very substance that had ignited the conflict, was now legal and freely sold at all open ports. The dragon was defeated, and its blood and essence could now be exploited without restraint by anyone eager to profit. Thus, the Opium Wars came to an end, two brief yet extraordinarily brutal conflicts that transformed not only China but the entire world. They marked the beginning of an era of high imperialism, vividly demonstrating that Western industrial power and military technology could crush even the most ancient and formidable resistance. Yet, their legacy proved to be far more profound and enduring than mere opening of ports and trade privileges. The scars and lessons of those wars lingered on, shaping the course of history long after the guns fell silent. Like a cloud of opium smoke, it enveloped China's future for many decades, and its echoes can still be heard today. For China, the Opium Wars marked the beginning of a century filled with humiliation, a period stretching from the early 19th century until the final years of the 1940s. During this era, the once proud Middle Kingdom was reduced to a semi-colony, torn apart by foreign powers eager to carve out their share of influence. Not only Britain and France, but also Russia, Germany, the United States, and most painfully, Japan, actively participated in these divisions. The unequal treaties imposed on China stripped the nation of its sovereignty, ceding control over its customs, trade, and financial systems to foreign interests. Meanwhile, opium addiction, which had been legalized at some point, continued to ravage Chinese society, transforming into a widespread epidemic, unprecedented in scale. By the beginning of the 20th century, millions of Chinese people had fallen victim to drug dependence, turning an entire nation into a deeply poisoned and humiliated society. The defeats suffered in various wars, coupled with the inability of the ruling Qing dynasty to resist external demands, eventually led to its complete collapse. This collapse sparked a series of destructive uprisings, with the Taiping Rebellion standing out as one of the most devastating. Ultimately, in the year of 1911, the imperial monarchy was overthrown, but this did not bring lasting peace to China. The country plunged into chaos, marked by civil war between nationalist and communist factions, along with Japanese occupation. It was in the furnace of this century of insult and upheaval that the modern Chinese nationalism was forged. Memories of the Opium Wars, the burning of the Summer Palace, and the humiliating unequal treaties became foundational elements of the new national identity. These traumatic memories fostered a profound, almost instinctive mistrust of the West and a fierce desire to restore China's rightful place in the global order, aiming to cleanse the stain of shame left by the past. Today, when Chinese leaders speak of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, it is crucial to understand that behind their words lies the shadow of those Opium Wars. China's assertive and sometimes confrontational foreign policy, its drive for technological independence, and initiatives like the Belt and Road, all largely serve as responses to the trauma inflicted over a century and a half ago. China, more than ever before, refuses to be weak or humiliated again. For Britain and the West, the Opium Wars stand as the pinnacle of imperial arrogance and cynicism. They brought enormous profits, opened new markets, and cemented Western dominance on a global scale. Yet, at the same time, they forever tarnished the reputation of a supposedly civilized world. The story of how one nation forcibly compelled another to buy drugs for its own gain remains one of the most shameful chapters of colonial history. It serves as a lasting reminder of how rhetoric about free trade and a civilizing mission can be cynically exploited to mask greed and brutality. In the 21st century, the world finds itself on the brink of profound transformations. A rising, confident, and powerful China stands at the threshold of reshaping global dynamics, while Western dominance appears to be waning. In this emerging world landscape, the history of the Opium Wars echoes not as a distant story of the past, but as a stark warning. It warns against the dangers of arrogance, the inability to understand other cultures, and the temptation to use force to solve economic and political problems. This legacy continues to remind us that history's lessons are timeless, highlighting the destructive consequences when imperial hubris, cultural insensitivity, and violent means are employed in pursuit of national interests. The fog of opium that once cloaked China during the 10th century has long since dispersed into history. However, the haze of mistrust and unresolved historical grievances, born out of the actions and policies of the emperors, continues to linger over our world. This persistent fog serves as a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It doesn't just fade away into oblivion, but rather it remains an ever-present shadow shaping the present and future. Thank you for taking the time to delve into this intricate chapter of history, one of the most complex and dramatic periods in the collective story of humankind. Exploring such a turbulent and pivotal era offers an opportunity to better understand how past struggles and triumphs have left indelible marks on the course of nations and civilizations. If this journey through time has proven engaging or insightful for you, consider seeking out more stories that illuminate the grand arc of history, moments of transformation, conflicts, and cultural shifts that continue to influence our world today. Your interest and attention are invaluable. They serve as vital encouragement for the ongoing effort to unravel and share these compelling narratives from the depths of our collective past.